This is the member update. We try and do these quarterly. And this is Greg Oxton speaking. I'm with the Consortium. Also on the phone is Kelly Murray and Melissa George, my colleagues on the staff. And I was mentioning a little earlier that I was really trying to shrink this deck down to something reasonable in size, and I couldn't do it. So I'm just going to go really fast. But what I will do is stop every once in a while and see if there are questions, particularly at the end of each, as we discuss each of the initiatives. In the deck, there are a number of hidden slides as well, which if you download the deck, you'll have some of the background or backup information, some of the more detailed information. So the goal is just to cover some of the key topics that we've discussed over the last 3 months. Actually, we're going to do 6 months because we had the member summit in March and didn't do a member update. So we're going to cover essentially the first half of the year. And we organize our work into 5 initiatives, KCS version 6, and we'll touch on each one of these initiatives as we've progressed the thinking and iterated on these topics through the first 6 months of the year. KCS version 6, so we're currently at version 5.3, and we're working on what should KCS version 6 look like, and I'll tell you more about that. Intelligent swarming, this is collaboration on steroids, a very popular topic. Communities and social network, our community, social network, and support. We had a great meeting just a few weeks ago on that in San Francisco. A few updates there. The leadership framework for service excellence.
Muted.
I'm going to mute everybody because we're getting a lot of background noise. I think that if you want to talk, you can unmute yourself, even though I have muted everyone. Leadership framework for service excellence. So this is what we'll work on at the Executive Summit coming up in November, and have been working on for a couple of years with the executive conversations. And then the Customer Success Initiative, which is probably the newest of our initiatives. And we've had considerable updates on that as well. So that sort of forms the agenda. We're going to go through each one of those initiatives and talk about some of the evolving work. So events this year, we've had 1, 2, 3, well, we had the annual member summit in March. We had about 65 or 70 people there in San Diego. And then we had team meetings in January, April, June, and July. Some upcoming events. We're continuing the conversation on the predictive customer engagement ideas, which is part of the Customer Experience Initiative in Boston in September. We're doing our second intelligent workshop, intelligent swarming workshop, which is a 1-day workshop in Boston, also in September. Then October we'll be in the suburbs of Denver, talking about the evolution of KCS and KCS version 6. November in Sonoma is the Executive Summit. And December we have our annual Leadership Committee meeting. So that's what we've done and what we're planning to do. So now we're going to talk about each of the 6 initiatives. So we have a steering committee for the KCS version 6, and we will have this be the focus of the team meeting in October at a meeting hosted by Avaya actually in Westminster, which is north of Denver, between Denver and Boulder, in October. So some things we've been talking about. One is getting clear on what's the difference between KCS, intelligent swarming, and our community, social network, and support initiative. And I think one way to think about that is KCS is all about knowledge management practices, how to create and maintain content. Intelligent swarming is about collaboration and facilitating interactions between people. And communities, social networks, and support is about extending our reach or the number of people that are involved in the conversation, relevance, and diversity. And so those, well, all of the initiatives overlap and they're all synergistic. They each support each other. It's helpful for them to have an identity so we can talk about them. So this is the distinction we're currently making between KCS, intelligent swarming, and community and social networks. And then the big theme in KCS version 6 is making it generic, applying the KCS principles and practices to anything that's knowledge intensive, and really removing in the principles and practices, removing discussions that are related to cases or calls, but talk more about interaction. Knowledge is the byproduct of an interaction, and KCS is about capturing and maintaining the knowledge as you interact. Whether or not you handle cases is unique to a certain function. Here's the steering committee as it stands now. These are folks that have been participating in conference calls every other week over the last couple of months to talk about some of these things. A key concept in version 6 is to make KCS applicable to different functions and different industries beyond just tech support. So the idea is to copy the Linux model, where we would have the principles and practices be tightly controlled, but the techniques, which is the definition of how we do it, be specific to a function or an industry. And that would be open, and we'd collect techniques from everybody who's doing it and has interesting things to share. So the first thing we had to do is define what's a principle, what's a practice, and what's a technique. They've been kind of loosely defined in the current KCS practices guide. So after considerable conversation, we landed on the idea principles are a belief, and why. They're the core concepts, and principles can manifest themselves across multiple practices or techniques. A practice is how we organize what we need to do, and the solve and evolve loops seem to be serving that purpose quite nicely. So we intend, at least for the near term, to keep the 8 practices as they are, organized within the solve and evolve loops. And then the technique is how. So it's the more detailed definition of how you implement a particular practice in a particular function or industry. So the vocabulary, for example, would be unique or specific to the environment that these examples would come from. So a visual representation of that is we have at the core principles and practices, and those would be managed by a very small group, very much like the Linux kernel. And then the techniques, which would be unique or specific to, sorry, not unique, but specific to industries or functions, would be open, and we'd collect examples from lots of places, lots of functions, about how to do the practices and the principles. So it's a little bit of restructuring and being very clear about what are the underlying guiding beliefs or core concepts, and then how those might be interpreted in different environments. We have 12 candidate principles at the moment. We're working to consolidate those. We have 25 candidate updates to the KCS techniques for the KCS for Tech Support section, which is what is currently documented in the KCS Practices Guide. And we're looking to validate those through member experiences. And the big event around this will be the October team meeting in Denver. And I think the registration is up on the events page now for that. We're still in the final processes of sorting out the logistics. But if you're interested in participating in the conversation in terms of what some of these updates are, join us for that team meeting. And we're always looking for good member examples. There have to be a few operational examples where members are getting successful results with these practices or techniques before they become part of the guide. So any questions on KCS and what we're doing there? You'll have to unmute yourself if you have or raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, we will press on then. So intelligence swarming, this is unmuted. Station was in Hopkinton, hosted by EMC in June.
Greg, can I just interject and say questions and comments can also go in the chat section, and I'm watching that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. So it's interesting looking at the history of this conversation. We've been talking about it for about 12 years. it started as very much as a dream and a what if we could, really facilitate collaboration and support organizations rather than inhibit it with our traditional escalation processes and how we measure people's contribution. And it's been in the last, I think BMC was probably, well, HP Nonstop was probably the very first, and that was probably 5 or 6 years ago, and then BMC did some interesting things about 4 years ago, and now we have a handful of members, Red Hat, Cisco, PTC, and Sage, all of whom are making this dream operational. And the concept was to move from this streaming model, where you have level 1, level 2, level 3, and an escalation process, to a network model where people interact based on their relevance to the situation and actually help solve the problem. So it's a collaboration-based process, not an escalation-based process. And some look at it and say, well, what's different from swarming versus skills-based routing? And I think it's skills-based routing on steroids, or we sometimes say collaboration on steroids. I think the concepts are similar, but there's a few differences. So one is that in a swarming environment, the support organization functions as a single team of people. There's no distinction between level 1, level 2, level 3. There may be a distinction between generalists and specialists. And generalists would work on issues that are not well defined, and specialists tend to work on issues or help jump in on once the issue is well defined, when they can help resolve it. So there's no escalation, there's no handoff as a general rule. The person who takes the case owns it until it's resolved, which eliminates queue bouncing and having the customer redefine the problem over and over again as they move from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. And the big benefit that we're seeing is improving learning and skills. The first person to work on the issue is the most likely person to be able to resolve it. So there's a matching concept here that says we know something about the issue, we know something about the person that's reporting it, and we know something about the support agents that might respond. And we use those three things to help identify the best person to work on it. Then the support analyst that owns it is also able to find the best available people to help, and support analysts can see work that's relevant to them so they can offer to help if it's something they have expertise in or know the answer to, and they see somebody else is working on something. And then measuring creation of value, not activity, by individuals and teams. And I think we're learning a lot about the whole evaluation of people's contribution. I think the hope is that the reputation model will evolve to become the primary source of information about who's creating value and reflect people's contribution to the organization, which represents a pretty big change. That's an area we're very much still working on. If we can get there, though, it really shifts the manager's role to become coaches, not judges. And in order for collaboration to really work, the managers can't feel a sense of ownership around the people they coach, because that ownership really inhibits the collaboration that we're seeking to create. So the objectives are skills development, optimize people's ability to contribute, increase engagement and loyalty, improve customer success. And the concept is every interaction is an opportunity to improve the relevance of the next interaction, whether it's an interaction with a customer, between a support analyst and a customer, or between two support analysts. Every one of those interactions should create, one, some content, and two, some information about who the players are, what their preferences are, what their skills are, what their interests are, things like that. So Cisco is probably, at this point, one of the most sophisticated implementations of intelligence swarming. And they just reported at the last team meeting that we had at Hopkinton some of their benefits, and really starting to be able to quantify these benefits, and they were very compelling. So skills growth and accelerated learning, time to proficiency improving pretty dramatically for new people coming on board. Customer success and value realized, so a better customer experience, increase in customer sat that they largely attribute because of verbatim comments customers make in the sat surveys. They are attributing that to their swarming model. And a better way to deliver on the brand promise. So they've seen their resolutions improve. They see it as a much better way to resolve multi-technology issues more quickly. And most of the support analysts really enjoy it. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind with intelligent swarming is that you don't swarm with multiple resources from the support organization on every case. So what we're seeing from the 5 or 6 that are doing this is that generally anywhere from 20 to 30% of the cases require more than one resource from the support side to resolve. And the others, because of the what Cisco calls intelligent matching on the front end, if you get the right person on the call on the first touch, the probability they can solve it themselves is much higher. And so 70% of the cases are resolved fairly quickly without engaging other resources. So, and when they do engage, when they do have multiple resources, they solve problems faster, which is kind of counterintuitive. So we are hosting, I mentioned the Intelligent Swarming Workshop in Boston, September 15th, one day. We did the first one 2 months ago in the UK. Got some very, very positive feedback. We share the experiences from the case studies. We talk about where swarming is most relevant. So, for example, it's most relevant for moderate to high complex environments, or high percentage of sub ones, or those kinds of things. We've developed 7 scenarios to consider in designing the process. We talk about how to design a reputation model and the people profiles, and then we talk about tool functionality and integration requirements. So if you're interested in that, the registration is up on the events page. And I think that's it for swarming. Any questions on swarming? My prediction is that in the next, so I always get this wrong, so I'll say 3 years, which means 6. In the next 3 to 6 years, most support organizations will move from an escalation model to a collaboration model or a swarming model, if they're in an environment that's moderate to high complexity in terms of the issues they deal with. The benefits we're seeing across the board from the people who are the early adopters are better than anything we expected in terms of how well this works, if you do it right. So I think this is the next big thing for customer support in terms of process and structure. So next topic, communities, social networks, and support. We've refined the name of this initiative, and that happened as a result of some definitions that came out of the discussion at Lithium in July with Dr. Michael Wu. So social networks and communities. So they're 2 different things. Social networks are, the connections exist because of relationships between people. So Facebook is a social network. Communities are connected because of common interests. So the KCS LinkedIn group is a group of people who are interested in KCS, not because they have a relationship. And so that definition really helped clarify the difference between social networks and communities. And some of the capabilities that are around today are actually hybrids. That is, they facilitate both relationship-based connections and common interest-based connections. But it was, I think, through the course of the discussion for 2.5 days, it was very helpful to talk about these things as 2 different things, social networks versus communities. And helped us improve the clarity and organization of the journey matrix. Michael presented a framework for social and CX that was extremely well thought out and comprehensive. And then we looked at, unfortunately Sage wasn't with us at the meeting, but we used some of their slides from the past because they are, as far as I know, one of the leaders in leveraging social as input to assessing the customer experience. And it was a nice follow-on to Michael's conceptual model. And we, of course, had open space and talked about numerous topics. So this is, somebody may remember from past conversations about social and support was we talked about 5 tenets. We've consolidated them into 3: monitor, listen, and learn, let social support social, and improve, inform, and influence. And then there's numerous sub-bullets underneath each one of those about the things that you do in order to monitor, listen, and learn, the things that you do to facilitate the social to be successful, and the things that you do to improve, inform, and influence. We've also built the social engagement journey, and this is iteration 2 on this framework. So across the top we have the stages, and we've done a little bit of editing on the names, particularly value expansion. And there's actually another suggestion which we haven't reflected in the model yet, is to drop traditional because it really is uninteresting, and add a future state out on the right side. But so we have these phases of maturity, which we've labeled traditional, experimental, operational, value expansion, and fully integrated. And then down the side, we have some of the key elements or focus areas for the organization in terms of what's your strategy, what's your customer engagement model, what's your employee engagement model, how do you deal with people profiles, what kind of measurements are you using, do you have processes in place for crisis management in case you get a social storm, and then the tools dependency. So just to take a quick look at what the PDF actually looks like, there's a lot of detail in here. And in this section, we broke into teams, and groups of people went through and validated some of these stages and the content that's in each of these cells. So if you have a program around communities and social network and the intersection with support, this might be a helpful tool to figure out where you are and what kinds of things you might do next in terms of the evolution of that program. And of course, we're always looking for member experiences with these kinds of tools, because they're only helpful if people use them and find them, or if people find them useful. So that's what we mean by the social and support journey. And any questions on communities, social networks, and support? And Kelly's put the events, a link to the events page in the chat window. So, customer success framework. This is, as I mentioned, perhaps our newest initiative. I think we started this conversation at a meeting maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It actually leverages lots of the things that we've done in other bits of work, and it does include the predictive customer engagement model, which is something I'll talk about in a minute here. But the basic framework says there's a perspective or strategy level that talks about culture and leadership, and they do things like defining what's your brand promise, being clear on what are your values, what's the compelling purpose of the business, those kinds of things. Then there's a touchpoint model. We've embraced Esteban Kolsky's infinity loop here for the touchpoint model, and figuring out what are the key touch points, and are the customer experiences at each of those touch points in the customer lifecycle reinforcing your brand promise, or are they distracting from your brand promise? And then a model for assessment and improvement, which is observing what you can learn from this mapping of the customer lifecycle or touch points, customer journey mapping. There's a number of inputs that go into observing the customer experience, and then measuring the impact of that experience, analyzing and improving, and then measuring the impact of those improvements. So the 3 levels to this framework, and Sage has been one of the leading edge implementers of this, and they invented what they call the grinder, and they take various sources of data about the customer experience, from community, from journey mapping, from customer visits, from other voice of the customer programs, net promoter score, social networks activity and sentiment, and analyzing that activity. And then those key inputs are defined by the CX Council, which is a cross-functional group that sets the criteria and the priorities, and then they've created what they call the grinder, which is an algorithm that takes all of that data and creates an opportunity list that then is reviewed by the CX Council, and then for those things that they think are big hitters, and they assess it against their brand promise. Then they prioritize that list, and they could be knowledge article findability, usability and functionality in the products themselves, process and infrastructure changes, policy terms and conditions. And I think one of the things that has been surprising is that many of the issues that cause dissatisfaction and disrupted the brand promise or the experience for the customer in terms of realizing the brand promise is related to policy, which is an interesting, it's the terms and conditions and renewal contracts and things like that. Then those are assigned to the owners, the respective parts of the business, and improvements in various things in the right areas are made, and they update the list, and then they measure the impact. So that's kind of the high-level concept. This is actually how Sage describes it. These are all the inputs into the grinder. They are reviewed by the customer experience. They have the Advocacy Architecture Council. They design and implement, then they measure. And they've been doing this for about, I think Jim Pendergast, who's the Vice President of Customer Experience there, said that this has probably been maybe 2 or 2.5 years organizing all of this. And they're now to the point where some of their top priority changes have been implemented, and they're seeing something in the range of, for one particular product area where they made some changes, increase in renewal rates of increasing by 30%. And so they're now to the point where they're actually measuring the results of some of the changes they've made and validating the whole process in terms of improving customer experience with real business impacts that have financial and profitability implications. We've also been talking as part of the customer experience model is this idea of predictive customer engagement. So how do we provide information that we have that customers would value but don't know to ask us for? And so this is an interesting challenge. It's about striking the right balance between being helpful and being annoying. And I think in the past, many of the attempts at being predictive and proactive and telling customers about things that we think they should know about has more often ended up being annoying than helpful. But we have a number of members, Red Hat, BMC, Sage, seems to me there are a couple of others that don't come to mind at the moment, who are working on predicting customer needs and interests based on recent behavior. And so at Red Hat, they have a way of characterizing their customers into engaged and not engaged. I think they use a different terminology. I'm not sure that's Red Hat's terminology, but based on customers' behavior and activity, those who are engaged and busy doing things and they have some interaction with, they are pretty confident that they're having a positive impact on those. The ones who are not engaged are at risk. And since Red Hat's entire business model is based on subscriptions for service and updates in an open source software environment, renewal rates are very important to them. And so they're working on a number of techniques to detect and predict what customers might find valuable based on their behavior, but also to classify customers as those who are engaged and active and getting value from their subscription versus those who might be at risk because of inactivity, and what kinds of things can they do to help get them more active and engaged. So we had presentations from a number of different members, and this was hosted by the Apollo Group in Phoenix. And the Apollo Group is the organization that manages the University of Phoenix, and they talked about this concept from the point of view of students and recognizing when students are maybe at risk of not graduating or getting their degree, and what can they do to help engage them in a way that helps them, their students, be more successful. BMC talked about their program around helping customers migrate. That migrations have been a great source of frustration for both customers and the support organization, and so they've done some things to be a little more predictive and helpful in the migration process. And out of that, and Sage talked about some of the things they're doing in their customer experience model. Out of that, the group kind of organized some of the thinking and discussion into a model, like we do. And it had some history and role and segment and product kind of information. The one thing that I've found interesting on this was, and I think it came from Sage, maybe some others as well, but really better understanding the customers they interact with and what role they're in terms of what's the business function they're fulfilling within their respective companies. And that really helps them better understand who they should talk to on the support side. And then you have people. So all of this goes into a data analysis kind of an engine. And then their interactions. There's either value realized, neutral, or value erosion in terms of the customer experience with that interaction. And then hopefully there's some knowledge that's captured as a result of that interaction, both about the issue, which is what we would typically call a support article, or a knowledge article, sorry. But also about, also about the people and their role and the industry they're working in. And so this really further emphasizes our need to focus on two different knowledge assets. One is the knowledge article, which KCS focuses on quite nicely in terms of capturing the byproduct of an interaction to this people profile, which is emerging and has to become fairly rich and largely automated in order to really be useful in terms of better identifying what customers might be interested in and what they would benefit from, but don't know to ask for. So this, what we've called the know me factor, continues to show up as an important capability that we need to develop about knowing people and who they are, what they're up to, what role they play, what their interests are, what are their skills, all of those things. So then there's some feedback back into the analysis engine, which and decisions, which helps you identify potentially positive interactions, which hopefully create value realized. And then there's influence on the brand and the whole customer experience around whether you're strengthening your brand and reinforcing it, or whether the brand is eroding. So a fundamental element for customer success initiative and for the predictive customer engagement model is that the brand promise be explicit and well known, because that becomes the foundation against which you evaluate activities and processes and improvements. So any questions there on the customer experience model or a customer experience initiative or the predictive customer engagement concepts? I'm looking to see if people are still on the phone. Yes, there's still people on the phone. Okay. So some upcoming events. The Executive Summit, November 3 through 5. This is an annual event, and we do it by invitation. We try and ensure that this conversation is very strategic in nature, and so we manage the attendees more so than any of our other events to be, executive vice presidents, vice president, senior director kind of folks. And we talk about a variety of things, but a lot of the conversation is around leadership practices and leadership principles. This year we're going to have a guest from Gore, W.L. Gore and Associates, which is a company that's been recognized for years as being extremely innovative. And when you look at how they are organized and their policies and practices internally from an HR and management point of view, they are extremely different from the traditional organization. So we're going to have a chance to interview a manager from Gore, although they don't typically have titles. They have titles for external purposes only in terms of helping people outside the company understand what roles they have. But they have a concept of, if you call a meeting and people show up and are interested in your project, then you might be a leader. It's a very interesting organizational model. So we'll be exploring some ideas with the person from Gore on some different ways to think about organizational structure and process and hierarchies versus networks, and the potential of a hybrid model, employee engagement and skills development, utilization, some things like that. So if you have, so we invite executives from our member companies. We have a list of executives that we invite. If you want to know who from your company is on that list, send us an email, either myself or Kelly. We can tell you who's on that list. And if you have a vice president you think would enjoy being part of this conversation and meeting some of the other members, executive members, let us know who they are and we'll make sure they get an invitation. We do limit the group to about 30 people because it's hard to have a conversation with when it gets much bigger than 30. So let us know if you have executive candidates for that meeting or if you want to know who's on our list. So some upcoming events, August 14th, Designing an Intelligent Swarming Program online. So this is a conversation with Sage, Amy Dotson and her team at Sage that have been working on implementing intelligent swarming within a small group. I think it's considered a pilot. And so they're going to share their experiences. And then it's September 10th through the 12th, the Predictive Customer Engagement. That's a team meeting, face-to-face, 2.5 days. Boston, Massachusetts, hosted by PTC. And then September 15th, I already mentioned the Intelligent Swarming Workshop. 1 day on what it is and what we've learned about how to do it. September 26th, the KCS Metrics Matrix. So we have this thing we often refer to as the whole enchilada, which is an exhaustive list of all the measurements we've ever talked about. We haven't looked at it for a couple of years. And so we want to update that matrix. There's probably some new measures that we have been talking about recently that should be added. And the other thing is, it's interesting the matrix itself is a bit overwhelming if you look at it. So organizing the measurements into a framework, and Jen McIntosh and Francois Loputeau have both been doing some thinking around what a framework might look like. And so that's an online conversation about the metrics matrix. Early October, we're going to do the team meeting in Denver, hosted by Avaya. And that will be really looking to firm up some of the plans around KCS version 6. So KCS version 6 probably won't be available or released, I guess, till, well, probably 6 to 12 months from now. There's a fair amount of work in validating some of these updates and restructuring how we document these, the whole concept into the principles, practices, and techniques. So it's not something that's imminent, but something that we will continue to work on over the next 6 to 12 months. So if you're interested in that, join us in Denver. Then the Executive Summit, November, I already talked about that. Our leadership committee meeting. So once a year we host a meeting for our benefactor and sponsor level members. So they're the folks who pay the most money and often participate the most. And they have the opportunity to influence the initiatives, the definition and scope of the work we do. And so once a year we get that group together and review last year's work and talk about what's on the agenda for the coming year, and set some priorities and hopefully gain a little clarity around some of the projects that maybe aren't well defined. Then in March, I think we have a few program team meetings in early 2015. I think there's one that we're working on the details for January. But in March, we have the annual member summit, and we got such positive feedback about the Rancho Bernardo Inn, where we were last year. It's just a beautiful setting and a great venue and facilities that accommodate the things we like to do at our member summits. So we're going to go back there in March again in 2015. It'll be March 16th through the 18th, 2.5 days, and you should put that on your calendar. I'm not sure the registration is open for that yet, but and the topic we have is preliminary or tentative. We'll work on further defining what the actual topics will be for the member summit, but we'll certainly cover things like intelligence swarming and some of the other initiatives.